So if you have decided that the EAA applies to you and your services, what's the next step? Well, you need to look at the rules of a specific country. As I said, the EAA is a directive. The text of the directive does not apply directly to businesses. You need to look at the applicable law of the member state relevant to you. But which EU state might apply to you? Which member state's laws are applicable? Unfortunately, the directive itself doesn't make any provision for how to decide this. Unlike other EU legal frameworks, which do set out a method for deciding which country's regulator, for example, will be in charge of monitoring compliance. For example, NIS2, NIS2, new cybersecurity rules in the EU, the directive text there actually set out a mechanism for determining which EU member states apply, which rules apply. There's nothing like that in the EAA, unfortunately. So that really means you need to take a step back and think about general principles at an EU level, which might dictate the rules that you have to follow. And one of the most relevant principles for digital services, anyway, is the e-commerce directive, which is 24 plus years old, and it's the principle in there of the country of origin. The country of origin principle is subject to a number of exclusions now, but it's an assessment that you can make, which essentially requires organizations to comply with the rules of the EU member state where they are established in the context of operating those digital services. So oversimplifying it, if I, based on the definition of establishment, and that isn't said lightly, it's been developed through decades of EU case law and guidance. If I decide my organization, which is an e-commerce service established in Spain, but delivers to every country, if I'm confident that under EU laws, the rules of Spain apply to my e-commerce service, I only need to look to the Spanish transposition of the EAA as the source of the rules I need to comply with. But the problem is the concept of establishment under EU law applies EU-wide across all manner of legislation, not just accessibility. And making that establishment assessment can be really tricky. And it's something we are walking a lot of clients through at the moment, particularly those who previously may have decided that they don't have an establishment in the EU. And that might have been assessed for tax purposes, employment purposes. There's loads of other reasons assessments are made with regards to an organization's establishment. The one thing to note is that you obviously won't want to undermine any positions you've made publicly previously about your establishment. And if you are looking to make a change to that position, that you discuss it globally within your business, because it can have an implication on things like tax liability. So at the point where you've decided that perhaps you don't have an establishment in an EU market, it can get pretty tricky to decide which country's rules apply. And sometimes, unfortunately, you might need to look at the rules of every single country in the EU. But putting that to the side, once you've completed that assessment, in theory, and you know which rules apply to you, you will then have a better idea as to which set of legislation that you need to really digest and comply with. I'll talk more in a moment about the expected standards we're going to see in the digital accessibility space. But the good news is, and Michaela will echo this, largely we're expecting compliance with the EAA from a technical perspective to be measured against existing standards, which your development, web teams, engineers may already be pretty familiar with. So we'll cover that shortly, but what that does mean is that your organization may be somewhat on your way to compliance and more familiar with the requirements than you actually realize. It is also worth noting on the EAA's requirements, it's not prescriptive, it's very principles-based. It's tech agnostic, and of course that allows for those standards to be developed as time passes, and online services evolve and technology becomes more sophisticated. So it's really a constantly moving target in terms of compliance goals. Equally, there are some concrete obligations, more prescriptive obligations in the text of the EAA, the directive, plus potentially additional obligations, as I've said, at member state level in the local transposition. And that covers things like transparency and accessibility statements, or in some cases, specific accommodations which need to be made for things like audiovisual media services.